So it seems that the absolutely enormous Warhammer 40k Legends rules downloads are here for 10th edition 40k. Let's talk about the contents of them, and there's stuff here for most factions in the game, and go through what's here and what isn't. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about the Warhammer 40k Legends rules that Games Workshop has just put up for download on Warhammer Community. This was something that I was kind of wondering whether they were actually going to get round to doing for 10th edition or not. They had made their Legends of the Horus Heresy download for all the Space Marines and Chaos Space Marine stuff that went into Warhammer Legends before, but it does seem that they are following it up with a bunch of Legends units from previously in the game. Though with their absolutely enormous back catalogue of models, there's all sorts of weirdness, special cases, and things that might have been missed. As I'm sure plenty of you watching will be aware, 40k Legends is Games Workshop's system of their legacy rule set, basically making rules and a bit of playability for models or rule sets that they no longer support in their codexes. Most of these tend to be things that they had models for in the past, then stopped selling but still had the rules for. Though there are a few things that never had models basically, and you just had to convert the miniature, and a few things strangely enough that they still sell in their web stores, either on Games Workshop or Forge World, but for whatever reason they decided not to make them part of the main index anymore. In general, when they started doing these, I think it was broadly a positive step. Previously they might have just pulled all rule support and not given them any way to be played in game, or at least without you making some extensive house rules. Now though, their system is that they give the model a datasheet, a points cost, but then no further updates after that. So if they make anything too strong or too weak, it's not going to be included in any balance passes, potentially meaning that these have got a greater scope to be unbalanced compared with the rest of the game. In general, I think it's broadly seen as a positive move that they do actually support these old legacy units, but in general people tend to be very super happy to see kind of partial support for models they really might like and were a key part of their collection back at one point. In 10th edition, Games Workshop's maybe had a small but important mentality shift towards Warhammer Legends. They now seem to be trying to make these a lot more of an official part of the game, rather than saying to ask your opponent's permission before you play with the models. They now say that they're just basically allowed in all games of Warhammer 40k, besides things like competitive tournament play. They seem to, at least on paper, encourage that these should be okay for more casual games among friends, where often you might want to try and make it so there's not one side with a bigger disadvantage compared with another anyway. If you're not trying to absolutely super optimize and go for cutthroat competitive lists, then a little bit of imbalance on Legends datasheets might not be the worst thing in the world. Still though, I think quite a lot of people tend to be a little bit skeptical about using Warhammer 40k Legends things just in random pickup games or even in theory crafted lists that they're making. Being excluded from perhaps the higher levels of the game does still make them feel a little bit on the unofficial side, I think, and lots of people like the idea of running something in a game that they could credibly run in a tournament should they want to, I think. Plus a few people might shy away from them as not really wanting to try and build around them for any sort of power purpose. After all, if these things are by Games Workshop's own admission a bit more unbalanced than most, then it's probably not the best idea to just take all the most broken ones, as perhaps you're not really proving very much if your army just wipes the opponent off the board with the strongest ones. The download today though is really quite an enormous one. It's an absolutely huge document with 20 different documents from different factions, each of which has their own points cost as well. And alongside that they've also got a bit of a companion guide as well, a Warhammer Legends Counts As document, where they've got really quite a lot of units that they say they recommend running as a generic character from the codex or a generic pick from the other Legends rule sets. We also seem to have the Fortifications rules here as well. They basically were supported with a bunch of their terrain things that you could pick for any army, but they seem to have decided that that wasn't a good idea for 10th edition. Let's go through all the stuff in turn though and do a brief overview, looking at a few interesting units. First up, I thought it would make sense to start with this Legendary Units document, basically a big list of models that you can see on the left here, and then the datasheet that they recommend counting them as in-game. But it does mean for all of these models they haven't actually made a specially crafted datasheet for them or anything like that, so they are going to feel just like a bit of a generic character from there. The vast bulk of this table tends to be either Forge World characters or Games Workshop characters that have gone out of production. Say for example Tyberos the Red Wake, the iconic Carcharodon's character with the Chain Fist Lightning Claws. He's just recommended to be run as a standard Space Marine Terminator captain now. I guess you can take Lightning Claws on them. Generally the way that they've gone about this is that any of the Forge World Space Marine characters don't have any unique datasheets, perhaps the only major exception being Karab Khorne the Risen, who's a Relic Leviathan Dreadnought. There are a few tanks as well, and a few other notable things on the list too. Going down the list, here's just a few things that jumped out at me a bit. They do seem to have a fair few previously non-Primaris models, things like Tigerius in Artificer armour, or Corsaro Khan on foot. These just seem to be recommended as to be run as the generic Space Marine Librarian or Captain datasheets, so that does seem like a strange choice to me. Not sure why they wouldn't just have them run as their Primaris equivalents. I think one that might disappoint people a little bit is Brearth Ashmantle. I feel like perhaps he was one who deserved his own datasheet, given that he's got some quite different war gear, and it's quite a cool Salamander's character in the first place. For some reason they recommend you counting him as a standard Space Marine Dreadnought, which seems like a bit of a come down compared with what he was before. With his dual combat weapons, I can't help but think that something like an Ironclad Dreadnought or even maybe a Brutalis Dreadnought perhaps might have been a better proxy. Otherwise, there's a few units removed from the indexes here. The Sister Battle Celestians are just run as standard Battle Sisters now. They're basically just the veteran datasheet with the bolters. It's perhaps similar for the veteran Intercessor squad for the Primaris Space Marines. Again, they were basically just intercessors that got 2 attacks, and they're now recommended to be run as standard intercessors. Though again, that feels like a bit of a strange choice when you could have gone for Stern Guard as the option there. That's what I've heard a lot of people talking about for them. Knight Commander Pask is just recommended to be a generic tank commander. That one makes sense, I guess. There's a couple of the Blackstone Fortress characters, say for example Dyak Grek can be run as a Kroot Shaper. A fair few of the Chaos Renegades and Heretics units are here as well, things like the Militia Squad to be run as a Traitor Guardsman Squad, or Renegade Command Squad as a Dark Commune. There are a good few entries for them in the actual Legends datasheets in the Chaos Space Marine section though too, and we'll have a look at them in a second. Finally, there's a couple of generic tanks here as well, things like the Armageddon Basilisk, which has the enclosed crew compartment, and the Whirlwind Hyperios. Both of those are just recommended to be counted as their generic equivalents, which I think is kind of fine really. They do lose a bit of their unique flavour, and maybe out of the two, the Hyperios could have used its own datasheet perhaps to have its own anti-air rules, I think it was, but perhaps not the biggest deal in the world. Getting into the actual downloads though, and first off let's start with the generic Fortifications. They've got really quite an extensive list of their previous fortification kits that they sold that had rules. I think a few of these go back to when they had that Planet Strike supplement in days past. They've got things like the Void Shield Generator for 155 points, the Fortress of Redemption that perhaps had the Dark Angels like ramparts, the old version of the Aegis Defense line with the big gun and the defense line that's now a more generic Imperial Guard kit with its new model, and some Wall of Martyrs, wall sections, and bunkers. It is perhaps a little bit weird that they decided to mix these with generic picks like some of the random beasts that you can take from Blackstone Fortress. Things like the Amble and the Guardian Drone also have their points costs and rules here as well. Just for one example of a fortification, here's the Sky Shield landing pad. It's 125 points and really quite tough to kill with T12, 16 wounds, and a 3+, 5+ save. This one keeps a bit of its old flavour, giving a 5+ invulnerable save to infantry and fly models on top of it, and also healing aircraft for D3 lost wounds each turn as well. I think it is kind of nice they make these generic rules work for 10th edition as well. A lot of these bunkers and fortifications and things might not necessarily be things that you want to use in big match competitive games or anything like that, but they do seem like quite nice rules to have. Say if you're making a fluffy game where you're trying to assault an enemy fortress, it could take a bunch of these maybe. Next up, we've got the Space Marines, and their section is a bit weirdly split now, I suppose. They had their massive raft of Horus Heresy era units go to Legends previously, and that's all found in the Legends of the Horus Heresy document section. I can't help but think that they should probably just put all the Space Marines Legends rules together, which perhaps seems like a bit of an arbitrary distinction. The majority of the stuff that was here before, things like the Mortis Dreadnought, which is the ranged version of the standard Castaferum one. There's various Land Raider patterns, some of which were usable for 9th edition and have just become Legends now, going out of production, some of which have been Legends for a while, and I've got the full list of bike characters as well, things like the Ancient Librarian, Tech Marine and Apothecary, though it seems notably not the Chaplain now. I guess if you've got one of those you'd just run him as the Chaplain on bike from the Primaris range, even if he used to be basically the archetypical model they used when they were talking about Legends for images and things. Perhaps for more notable new entries on this one, we've got the Venerable Dreadnought here. It looks like that one's just a normal Dreadnought, but with slightly different options. It doesn't hit on a 2+ or anything, and doesn't get a Feel No Pain type save. I noticed there was a Relic Razorback with a multi-melter as well, though no laser and plasma option supported. That was a kit going back a long time. And another new entry is Carab Khorne the Risen, the Leviathan Dreadnought with his own unique loadout. Taking a closer look at him, he's 250 points and he gets a twin assault cannon on a fairly durable Leviathan chassis. They have actually made some pretty fun special rules for these guys. He's got the rights of battle like a captain, so you could have a great big dreadnought affected by a stratagem for free each turn, though you wouldn't be able to stack that with other captains. And he can also fire in combat with no ballistic skill penalty at all. so he could blaze away pretty happily with his assault cannons and hunter-killer missiles if he wanted, even while he's tangling with them with his strength 12 and damage 4 with his Tarsus Scorpii weapon. Generally another big section whenever it comes to Legends and Legacy rules as the Astra Militarum. Forge World still has a very big range for them, but it used to be far bigger, perhaps notably with things like Deathcore and Elysians, most of which have been discontinued these days. There have been a whole bunch of new entries on this list in recent times, given a lot of things being discontinued with Forge World. I think perhaps one of the single most annoying ones for more mainstream 40k is the Vendetta gunship. That's the Valkyrie equivalent with the las cannons, and it was in the main Guard Codex back in 5th edition. Really quite a strong datasheet, so I'm sure a fair few people might have converted one at some point. 9th edition Legends didn't really have much support for the Elysian range, and that's kind of the same with 10th now. They've just got rules for the Drop Sentinel and the Sniper Squad, no generic Elysian infantry squads with deep strike or anything like that. I guess you could run them as Scions, perhaps. There's some super heavies with the Gorgon, Macarius Omega, and Arcus Stormhammer. I'm still honestly not sure why the Gorgon still keeps on winding up in Legends each time they update it. I don't know if anyone's just not getting the memo that they still sell the thing. It's a great big guard super heavy transport. Just feels like it should be one of the ones that's actually in the Forge World section as opposed to in Legends. Otherwise, for the Death Corps, they've got datasheets for the Grenadiers, their Storm Chimera, Centaur, Quartermaster Carder, and Death Rider Commissar. It does look like there's no datasheet for the Death Corps of Krieg Engineer Squad though now. That was a unit that was kind of recently discontinued, and it was actually a fairly powerful one in the latter days of 9th edition. Quite a popular datasheet that they really should have made some rules for, whether they make it Legends or part of the Forge World section of the game. There's a bunch of big guns here as well. Recent entries in the artillery section are the heavy mortar team and the quad launchers. They were playable for a while, plus Griffin mortars and a bunch of other things from the past as well. Again, Griffins were something that were present in the standard Guard Codex back a few editions ago. Then there's a whole bunch of miscellaneous stuff. Ryan and Rouse from the Blackstone Fortress set, the Rattling Twins, the Sentinel Powerlifter with its close combat attacks that are now strength 10, variant riders, the Mukali Riders, which I believe were a Talon unit, and a few Salamander and Taurus vehicle variants. Perhaps notable exceptions that don't appear to be either on the Count's as list or with an actual datasheet of their own are Commissar Yarrick and Creed and Kell. I was kind of wondering whether this will be the time when they got some Legends datasheets of their own. I guess realistically they're not too hard to just slot into an army. Yarrick could be a Commissar, Creed could take the place of his daughter, and Kell could be all manner of officers, but it seems a little bit strange that they didn't appear in either of the documents. Weird Vein Psychers were mentioned in the Count's as one, by the way. They count as Primaris Psychers now, so they don't get their own unique Legends datasheet. Those two are by far the biggest sections for the Imperium on their own. There are a few scattered bits for the other factions. Blood Angels have a Sanguinary Priest on bike, Space Wolves have an Iron Priest on a Thunderwolf, Ultramarines just have this on a guard set, perhaps one of the strangest things to have included in Legends here, as they still sell them fully on their Games Workshop web store. I guess the models have a bit more of a classic and firstborn type feel, but I think it does feel pretty bizarre that these guys have been made Legends when things like the Tyrannic War Veterans have a fully legal game datasheet, even if it's one that's particularly bad against anything but Tyranids. Otherwise, AdMech have their X-101 Servitor from Blackstone Fortress, Sisters of Battle have the Battle Sanctum, basically a fortification datasheet that they lost in 9th edition. That one allows you to do 2 acts of faith with one Sister of Battle unit within it, which isn't particularly exciting, I'd say. It does give a little bit of cover though, and it seems that Games Workshop is generally making fortifications like this all destroyable. So though this was basically a ruin type terrain piece previously, it's now got 20 wounds, toughness 11 and a 3+ save, so you can kill it, though it is very tough. For the Agents of the Imperium, there's the return of the Damned Legionnaires. Perhaps not the most enormously exciting rules for them, kind of similar to a regular tactical squad with just ignores cover. Deep Strike, a 4+ invulnerable save and handing out a battle shock test. Not terrible, but maybe no interesting surprises on the datasheet maybe. There's Janus Drake, the Blackstone Fortress Rogue Trader, 025, the Old Man of Iron, and a couple of Grey Knights options with a Dreadnought and a Razorback with Psy Cannons. The Chaos Space Marine section I think is fairly interesting. The Galapox Infected I think were a little bit of a surprise to go here. They're a fairly recent kit that Games Workshop re-released for Kill Team and gave some 40k rules when they did. Seems a bit strange that they've supported the Chaos Beastmen with Warhammer 40k rules to play there, but for some reason they don't feel like giving these a datasheet that you can play in game, even if it was one that was kind of underwhelming for the Death Guard and the Chaos Marines before. As previously, there's still 2 different units, the Galapox with the great big Nightmare Hulks and the Mutants, and then the big swarm of the Mutoid Vermin. Otherwise, the other half of the Renegades and Heretics units are here. There are datasheets for things like the Renegade Enforcer, the Plague Ogrins and the Ogrin Brutes, Renegade heavy weapon teams which are pretty similar to the standard Astra Militarum version now, and a Rogue Psycho who can attach to some of the different cultist units. Mutilators make their appearance here after they were cut from the previous Chaos Space Marine Codex without getting a Legends datasheet in 9th. Not exactly everyone's favourite models there though. The Hellblade and the Hell Talon are here. Games Workshop deciding that these are more contemporary 40k things than things that were present in the Heresy apparently. And then similarly to the previous section of Legends, there's a whole bunch of leaders on bikes or deity-specific mounts, things like Palanquins of Nurgle or Steeds of Slanesh. Perhaps for notable things that aren't here are things like the Chaos Lord and Sorcerer with jump packs. I was kind of expecting them to be included alongside the bikes and the deity-specific things. Games Workshop seemed to feel that they were important enough to add to the Legends document in 9th edition, as people were quite unhappy when that option went away for the Chaos Space Marines, particularly as they'd sold them fairly recently. That does seem like an option that they probably should have included here. Here's a datasheet for the Space Marine Sorcerer on a Palanquin of Nurgle. He can join either Chosen Legionaries or Plague Marines, and he gives this squad Sustained Hits 1, the standard sort of smite attack that most sorcerers get, an aura of -1 battle shock, and also a fairly extensive choice of war gear here. I do feel like, at least rules-wise, these things are often being treated with a similar sort of level of ideas and creativity compared with the main 40k releases. Maybe not quite as many unique special rules, but they all do tend to do some interesting stuff with their unit abilities. I was kind of interested to see the new profile for the Mutilators as well. These are 185 points for 3 of them, and are basically the combat version of the Obliterators. They've got a similar sort of defensive profile, though obviously without the guns. They instead have a strike or sweep mode in melee, but they're not really going to be much of a threat to most things that are greater than medium infantry. Their special rule seems to be a fight and death. I can't help but think for the points difference, Obliterators do look quite a lot better though, as they still fight okay in melee, plus have some fairly serious guns going. The Deity Chaos Legions do get a little bit of support, as with the Forge World Legends of the Horus Heresy. They get a list of units that can be included in their army from the standard Chaos Space Marine ones, and how to adapt the keywords to do so. The Death Guard get the most love here, with things like the Palanquin Lord and the Gelapox Infected and Mutoid Vermin here, and all 3 of them get both the Hellblade and the Hell Talon. Death Guard also appear to have a Legends datasheet for their Possessed unit as well. That one used to be part of their codex in 8th and 9th edition, now it's gone to Legends it would seem. I guess GW trying to keep the Chaos Space Marine line and the Death Guard line as separate as possible. They do seem to be trying to make them into their own things. Otherwise for Chaos, we've got the Chaos Demon Forge World units, a bunch of various lesser demons like the Plague Toads, Pox Riders, and the Giant Chaos Spawn, alongside those really big super greater demons. Things like Angrath the Unbound, the Unique Bloodthirster, or Scabithrax the Bloated, the Enormous Great Unclean One. They've also got a datasheet for Chaos Furies as well. I can't help but think that they'd almost certainly see play competitively if they were included in the Chaos Demons main codex. They're just 40 points for 5 of them with a 5+ invulnerable save, and move around quickly with fly and a 12-inch move. Seem like a pretty much ideal screening and objective grabbing unit for things like tactical objectives there. For the Aeldari, there's a whole bunch of the Forge World Flyers that went into Legends at one point or another. The really big vampire ones, plus the Phoenix and the Firestorm, and a whole bunch of the Corsair units from the previous Forge World army. They've been out of production for really quite a good while now. They've also got Amelin Shadow Guide here, the Blackstone Fortress character who gets her own datasheet, and the Bone Singer that they made alongside the Dawn of War series. Fairly cool to still see some representation for that one. Amelin Shadow Guide's datasheet looks a little bit underwhelming really. 75 points for a unit that's really quite hard to kill. Infiltrator's lone operative and stealth and gets a reactive movement. She allows you to redeploy one unit, but has a really quite underwhelming range-along rifle that doesn't really do anything more than the standard sort. Seems pretty underwhelming compared with Illic Nightspear, who's actually got a very decent scary datasheet. For the Orks, there's a mix of older Forge World things that went out of production, plus quite a few units from their previous codexes that got overshadowed by new releases, things like the big guns that got traded out for mech guns, and the old school style of buggies with the Scorchers, War Buggies and War Tracks that got replaced by the new series of buggies that they made more Mad Max style. They've got old choices for biker, pain boys, and big mechs as well. The Forge World Warboss on Warbike is still playable in the actual Forge World section for Orcs, and otherwise they've got a whole load of different tanks, including things like a cannon wagon that could be quite good to use as a looted wagon maybe, and a couple of planes like the Attack Fighter, Chinook Warcopter, and the Fighter Bomber. They also have the Christmas promotion miniature for the Red Gobbo here as well. He looks kind of fun as a little character to lead Gretchen. He gives +1 to hit for his grots, so they shoot a little bit straighter, and gets the oldly Christmas rule of have you been a good little grot this year, dropping off a grenade stratagem for 0 CP on the enemies. The Tau have really quite a good few choices here as well. Lots of things that have been out of production for a while, including the Narlock Riders and the Greater Narlock from the older Kroot range, a few other drone things, and an Orca dropship, though perhaps the most notable new entries for Legends for Tau are Shah's Overlie and the XV9 Hazard battlesuits, both of which were perhaps some of the more popular out of the Tau Forge World army. The hazard suits are maybe not enormously different from the Crisis, a little bit slower and a little bit tougher. They've got the choice between a Twin Links burst cannon, a phased ion gun with 4 shots at strength 6 AP1, and a fusion cascade, which is basically a jump top fusion blaster, getting Melter 4 rather than Melter 2, though you would have to get it into 6-inch range for that to trigger now. Their rule is being able to debuff infantry, where they can make them -2 to move, advance and charge. Could be useful enough to hand out as a debuff against the right army. I guess maybe could be worth it for one hazard suit with a phased ion gun for that utility, as well as just being a unit just jumping around the board doing tactical objectives and things. They don't seem enormously strong from a raw damage and defense perspective though. Finally, a bunch of the other Xenos factions have a few interesting bits. The Drukhari have their Raven fighter, and now the Reaper with its anti-tank firepower also went to Legends as well. That takes their Forge World units just down to the Tantalus alone. I was kind of surprised to see a Genestealer cult entry here, given that they're a really quite recent army, but it looks like they've decided to put the Tectonic Frag Drill into Legends, it would seem. Interestingly, the new rules for this one seem to be that it doesn't really do much in-game, but it basically just acts as an anchor for the Genestealer cult force and allows you to redeploy blips next to that if the enemy moves close enough to remove them from the board. To be honest, given that Genestealer cult are already incredibly strong at the moment, giving them a way to save their blips from the one way to scrub them out, that does seem kind of obscenely strong. Could easily be worth it in competitive lists at 125 points though, if it weren't Legends. The Necrons have their Gauss and Sentry pylons here, the Nightstride Bomber, and those Tomb Citadel walls. And the Tyranids have a few entries as well, new entries for the Dimacaron and the Malanthrope, plus the Sky Slasher Swarm Rippers. The Malanthrope appears to be a Venomthrope leader now that gives them extra range on their -1 to hit, plus a damage buff for them in combat too. The Dimacaron still seems to be pretty fast general purpose, and it's likely to be pretty scary against most things in combat with strength 9, damage 3 and twin linked attacks, though it is missing a points value at the moment, so it's not very easy to play at the moment. So anyway, there we have it. That's the Warhammer 40k Legends rules for 10th edition, it would seem. I think it is good that Games Workshop makes the effort for these. Good to have some out-of-production models still be able to be playable in-game. Though of course, as always, it'd be nicer if they kept on supporting at least a few of the more popular ones of these. Some options are just a little bit sad to have removed from the game. Let me know your thoughts on them in any case, and any other interesting details that you spotted through the various armies. There's really quite a lot of information here. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep up the regular 40k content. I do try and keep up with Games Workshop's news, rumours and rules releases. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.